At first glance, Red Bull looks like a classic startup success story. A new product enters the market, finds demand, and scales into a global empire. But the truth is, almost nothing about Red Bull made sense when it began. The drink was expensive, unfamiliar, and didn't fit neatly into any existing category. It wasn't soda, it wasn't coffee, and it didn't solve a problem people were actively complaining about. Even more unusual was the man behind it. This wasn't a young founder chasing disruption, or a technologist building something new from scratch. The person who brought Red Bull to the world was a 40-year-old toothpaste salesman, working inside an established company, far removed from startup culture. By the standards of modern entrepreneurship, he was late, unremarkable, and positioned entirely in the wrong place. And yet, within a few decades, Red Bull would become one of the most valuable beverage brands on earth. That raises a question most success stories avoid. If the product wasn't revolutionary and the founder didn't fit the mold, what actually made this work? Because the answer has less to do with energy drinks and far more to do with how people think, how they identify, and what they choose to believe. Dietrich Mateschitz didn't come from engineering, chemistry, or design. He came from sales. For years, he worked in marketing roles within the consumer goods world, including selling toothpaste, a category defined by routine, repetition, and brand perception rather than excitement. It was the kind of work that trained you to understand how people choose, not how products are built. By the time he reached his 40s, Mateschitz wasn't chasing a bold new vision. He was established, experienced, and deeply familiar with how crowded markets behave. He understood that most products fail not because they're bad, but because they never escape sameness. In categories like beverages, toothpaste, or household goods, difference matters more than improvement. That perspective shaped everything that came next. When Mateschitz encountered an energy drink in Asia, he didn't see a breakthrough formula. He saw behavior. He noticed when people drank it, why they drank it, and how it made them feel about themselves. The drink wasn't popular because it tasted good. It was popular because it had a purpose in people's lives. Most entrepreneurs would have tried to refine the product, adjust the flavor, or make it more familiar to Western consumers. Mateschitz didn't. Instead, he recognized that familiarity was the enemy. If the drink blended in, it would disappear. At an age when many people settle into safe decisions, he did the opposite. He bet not on chemistry, but on psychology. Not on mass appeal, but on meaning. And without fully realizing it yet, he began building something that wasn't a beverage company at all, but a belief system disguised as a can. When Dietrich Mateschitz decided to bring the drink to Europe, the reaction was immediate and mostly negative. Investors didn't see opportunity, they saw confusion. The beverage didn't fit existing shelves, didn't match known tastes, and didn't solve a problem consumers were actively demanding answers to. From a traditional business perspective, the risk was obvious and unnecessary. The drink was expensive to produce, unfamiliar to Western markets, and carried regulatory challenges due to its ingredients. Even the name sounded strange. There was no proven category for energy drinks at the time, no market data to point to, and no reason to believe consumers would abandon coffee or soda for something they didn't recognize. But Mateschitz wasn't asking the usual question of whether people wanted it. He was asking whether people could be taught to want it. Instead of lowering the price or altering the formula to appeal to mass taste, he made a counterintuitive decision. He kept the drink exactly as it was. He preserved the unusual flavor. He packaged it in a small, slim can that immediately signaled a difference. And he priced it higher than most alternatives, not to compete, but to separate. This wasn't stubbornness, it was positioning. By refusing to explain the product too much, he allowed curiosity to do the work. By making it feel niche and slightly inaccessible, he avoided the trap of trying to please everyone. Investors saw limitation. He saw leverage. What looked irrational from the outside was actually disciplined restraint. Instead of chasing volume, he focused on perception. Instead of convincing the masses, he aimed to influence a specific kind of person, someone drawn to novelty, intensity, and identity. At this stage, Red Bull wasn't being built to scale quickly. It was being built to mean something, and that choice would shape everything that followed, from how it was marketed to who it attracted first. Because the real risk wasn't that people wouldn't like the drink, the real risk was that they wouldn't care, and Mateschitz designed the entire strategy to make that impossible. Instead of launching Red Bull through traditional advertising, Dietrich Mateschitz did something that felt almost irresponsible by conventional standards. He didn't try to explain the drink, he didn't list benefits. He didn't compare it to coffee or soda. In fact, for a long time, he avoided mass advertising altogether. What he focused on instead was association. Red Bull appeared first in places where energy wasn't a concept but a lived experience: nightclubs, underground music scenes, extreme sports events that most brands wouldn't touch because the audiences were small and the risks were high. The drink wasn't positioned as something you consumed, it was positioned as something you belonged with. This distinction mattered. People weren't told that Red Bull would give them energy. They were shown what energy looked like. It looked like motion, risk, freedom, and control. It looked like people pushing themselves beyond comfort, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And once that image settled in, the drink itself became secondary. Mateschitz understood something most brands miss. Identity travels faster than information. If people see a product consistently linked to a certain type of person, they don't need convincing. They self-select. They buy not because they were persuaded, but because they recognize themselves in the message. Red Bull also resisted ubiquity early on. Distribution was limited. The drink didn't flood supermarkets overnight. It appeared selectively, almost mysteriously, which made it feel discovered rather than sold. Scarcity wasn't a supply issue. It was a strategy. And then there was the tone. Red Bull never begged for attention. It didn't chase trends. It didn't explain itself. That silence did something powerful. It invited interpretation. Consumers filled in the meaning themselves, which made the connection stronger than any slogan ever could. By the time Red Bull began expanding more aggressively, the groundwork was already laid. People didn't see it as a new drink entering their world. They saw it as a symbol that had finally arrived. This was the turning point. Because once a brand stops selling a product and starts selling a feeling, competition becomes irrelevant. You can copy the ingredients, you can copy the packaging, but you can't copy the emotional shortcut that's already taken root in people's minds. Red Bull didn't grow by convincing people it was useful. It grew by convincing them it was them. As Red Bull's presence expanded, one of the most surprising things was not how fast it grew, but how carefully it restrained itself. Most brands, once they find traction, rush toward visibility, saturation, and volume. Red Bull did the opposite. It grew, but it did so selectively, guarding its image with an almost obsessive level of control. Dietrich Mateschitz understood that once a brand loses its edge, it becomes just another product. So Red Bull didn't simply sponsor events, it built them. It didn't just advertise athletes, it absorbed them into its world. Extreme sports teams, racing programs, media houses, all of it was designed to ensure that Red Bull wasn't borrowing culture, but owning it. This level of control allowed the brand to remain consistent no matter how large it became. Every visual, every event, every partnership reinforced the same message without ever stating it directly. Red Bull stood for intensity, risk, and performance, not because it claimed to, but because that was the only environment it chose to exist in. At the same time, the company remained unusually private. Financial details were limited. Leadership stayed out of the spotlight. Even as Red Bull became a global name, it retained a sense of distance. That mystery wasn't accidental. Visibility creates familiarity, but mystery creates intrigue, and intrigue sustains value far longer than exposure ever could. As competitors entered the market, they focused on the obvious elements. They copied the can, they copied the flavor profile, they copied the messaging about energy and focus, but what they couldn't replicate was the ecosystem Red Bull had built around itself. An ecosystem where the drink was only one piece of a much larger psychological framework. By the time Red Bull fully embraced mass distribution, it no longer needed to convince anyone. The brand had already been validated by culture. It had already been adopted by a specific type of person. And that adoption gave it protection. New entrants could compete on price or ingredients, but Red Bull wasn't competing in the same category anymore. It wasn't selling beverages. It was selling access to a mindset. And that is what allowed a strange, expensive drink launched by a 40-year-old salesman with no revolutionary product to scale into a multi-billion-dollar empire without ever losing its identity. By the time Red Bull reached global scale, the question was no longer whether it would succeed, but what it had actually become. The company was no longer defined by shelves in convenience stores. It was defining entire spaces, sports, media, events, and youth culture, where its presence felt natural rather than commercial. Red Bull didn't just sponsor moments, it created them. From extreme sports competitions to record-breaking stunts, the brand positioned itself at the edge of what felt possible. These weren't advertisements in the traditional sense, they were narratives. Stories people wanted to watch, share, and remember, often without consciously registering that a product was being marketed at all. This shift changed the balance of power. Competitors could match distribution and even undercut price, but they couldn't replicate the emotional infrastructure Red Bull had spent years building. The brand had become a filter through which people interpreted performance, ambition, and risk. Drinking Red Bull wasn't about energy anymore. It was about alignment. At the center of it all was a founder who never chased visibility for himself. Dietrich Mateschitz remained largely in the background, allowing the brand to speak instead. That distance reinforced the idea that Red Bull was bigger than any individual, not a personality-driven company, but a system designed to perpetuate belief. The result was an empire that didn't feel like one, a global brand that rarely explained itself, and a business built not on constant persuasion, but on long-term psychological positioning. It's tempting to reduce this story to motivation or luck, but that misses the point. Red Bull didn't win because it had a superior product. It won because it understood something deeper about how people make decisions. We don't choose based on logic alone. We choose based on identity, emotion, and the stories we want to tell about ourselves. A 40-year-old toothpaste salesman didn't build a $27 billion empire by out-innovating everyone else. He did it by out-positioning them, by refusing to compete where others were loud and instead building meaning where others were silent. Red Bull didn't ask people to buy energy. It gave them permission to feel driven, daring, and different. And that may be the most uncomfortable lesson of all. In markets crowded with better products and smarter technology, the real advantage often belongs to those who understand psychology better than anyone else. Because in the end, Red Bull didn't just give people wings. It gave them a story they wanted to live inside.